Today we are wrapping up the book of Judges and talking about the civil war between the tribe of Benjamin and the rest of Israel. The only way I could really describe this story is as a black diamond of sorts. This story has some of the most grotesque and intense images in the whole Bible, but somehow there's so much symmetry and powerful messages that make up even the minute details of this finale. That amidst the chaos and the grotesque sins, there's order, structure, and dare I say, beauty. I think that a lot of people, including myself, will try to skip over these stories because of how intense they are. But I believe that buried in these Stygian shades is a ray of hope. Today we are gazing into an abysmal gem of sin and despair. And I actually pray that the abyss may stare back. That it may give you a sobriety towards the evil depths that all humans, including me and you, are capable of descending to. But I also pray that you may see hope staring back at you from amidst this black diamond. Hope for how far God can pull up his people from the abyss, and hope for even the most far gone of families and people. As a warning, if you couldn't already tell, we are going to be talking about some pretty graphic stories today, so a viewer and a parent's discretion is advised for anyone watching with kids. So with that out of the way, today we are talking about civil wars and black diamonds. Here we go. So before we start our time today, I would like to set the context for our story. If you remember, the previous story was about the tribe of Dan taking their false promised Neverland, and it has just ended with the tribe of Dan setting up the cursed idol that they stole from Micah. And at the end of the story, we were given this little note that this cursed idol was set up in the house of God at Shiloh. I didn't really talk about Shiloh last time, and we haven't really talked about it in this podcast until now. This is like a small town in the tribe of Ephraim, which means something like place of rest or tranquility. Notably, this town of Shiloh is not really near the city of Laish, which is a bit strange because if you remember, the city of Laish, which was named after the tribe of Dan, their ancestor Dan, is where the whole tribe of Dan settles. So the whole tribe of Dan settles to the city of Laish and renames it the city of Dan after their ancestor. And it's a bit strange for the tribe of Dan to steal this idol from Micah, get the priest Jonathan, the grandson of Moses, and then set up the idol in a place called Shiloh that's not really near their city. It's a little strange that it's set up in a place that's not their hometown. But Shiloh, like many other things in this story, is a city and a theme that connects the previous story to this last story in the book of Judges. I think that Shiloh is almost like a false or pseudo resting place for Israel, very similar to how the city of Laish was a false promised land for the tribe of Dan. Shiloh will be an important city at the end of our story today, so it won't really show up until the end of the book of Judges and the end of our story, but it's also going to be a really important city in the next book of the Bible, in the Samuel scroll. Okay, so something to tuck away and to keep in your back pocket as we read through our story today. With that being said, let's jump into the beginning of the last story of the book of Sheriffs. Judges 19, starting in verse 1. Now it happened in those days when there was no king in Israel that there was a certain Levite sojourning in the remote part of the hill country of Ephraim, who took a concubine for himself from Bethlehem in Judah. But his concubine was unfaithful to him, or found him repugnant, and she went away from him to her father's house in Bethlehem in Judah, and was there for a period of 4 months. Then her husband arose and went after her to speak to her heart in order to bring her back. And his young man was with them, as well as a pair of donkeys. So she brought him to her father's house, and the girl's father saw him and was glad to meet him. And his father-in-law, the girl's father, prevailed upon him, and he remained with him 3 days. So they ate and drank and spent the night there. Now it happened on the 4th day that they got up early in the morning, and he arose. And the girl's father said to his son-in-law, "Sustain your heart with a piece of bread, and after that you may go." So both of them sat down and ate and drank together. And the girl's father said to the man, "Please be willing to spend the night, and let your heart be merry." Then the man arose to go, but his father-in-law pressed him, so that he turned back and spent the night there. And on the 5th day he arose to go early in the morning, and the girl's father said, "Please sustain your heart and wait until the day declines." So both of them ate. Then the man arose to go along with his concubine and his young man, and his father-in-law, the girl's father, said to him, "Behold now, the day has drawn to a close. Please spend the night. Behold, the day is declining. Spend the night here, that your heart may be merry. Then tomorrow you may arise early for your journey, so you may go out to your tent." But the man was not willing to spend the night. So he arose and went and came to a place before Yavuz, that is, Jerusalem, and there were with him a pair of saddled donkeys. His concubine was also with them. They were alongside Yavuz, and the day was almost gone. And the young man said to his master, "Come, please, and let us turn aside to the city of the Jebusites, and spend the night in it." However, his master said to him, "We will not turn aside to the city of foreigners who are not of the sons of Israel, but we will pass on by until Gibeah." Then he said to his young man, "Come, and let us draw near to one of these places, and we will spend the night in Gibeah or Ramah." So they passed along and went their way, and the sun set on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. Then they turned aside there in order to enter in and to spend the night in Gibeah. So they entered and sat down in the open square of the city. Now no one was taking them into his house to spend the night. But look, an old man was coming from his work from the field at evening. Now the man was from the hill country of Ephraim, and he was sojourning in Gibeah. But the men of the place were Benjamites. And he lifted up his eyes and saw the traveler in the open square of the city. And the old man said, "Where are you going, and where do you come from?" And he said to him, "We're passing from Bethlehem in Judah to the remote part of the hill country of Ephraim. I am from there, and I went to Bethlehem in Judah. But now I am going to the house of Yahweh, and no man is taking me into his house. Yet there is both straw and fodder for our donkeys, and also bread and wine for me, your maidservant, and the young man who is with your servants. There is no lack of anything." Then the old man said, "Shalom to you. Only let me take care of all that you lack. However, do not spend the night in the open square." So he brought him into his house and gave the donkeys fodder, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. Okay, that was a lot. We're going to pause here. This is the setup for our story. There's a few things to note here. First of all, as I mentioned before, there's a few bridges in this beginning part of our story that connects us to the previous story about the tribe of Dan taking the city of Laish. So first, there's the lines at the beginning of the narrative that this story happens in those days when there was no king in Israel. As you may remember, this is the same phrase that is used multiple times in the previous story. This does two things for us. So it first frames for us when this story happens, which is going to be really important. That is, the story happens in the days of the period of time when there was no king in Israel. It's the same time that the same period of time that the story of the tribe of Dan taking their false promised land takes place right before this. So these two stories are supposed to take place in the same time period. It also cues us into what kind of time this story takes place in. That is, in a time when people do whatever they want, and there is not much civil or civic order within the nation of Israel. Additionally, there's a few details peppered throughout this narrative that connects it to the previous story. So in the previous story, there was this wandering Levite named Jonathan, Moses' grandson. Jonathan is said to be from Bethlehem in Judah, and he journeyed to the hill country of Ephraim. Here, there is another wandering, nameless Levite who is from the hill country of Ephraim, and who also has connections to Judah. Namely, his concubine is from Judah. So in the previous story, the Levite Jonathan ended up ministering at an idol shrine in the hill country of Ephraim. In this story, this Levite is trying to go back to the house of Yahweh in Ephraim while he is in Judah. And that phrase, the house of God, or it's the house of God in Ephraim, is probably a reference to Shiloh. And if you remember, the last story ended with that idol, that cursed idol, being set up at the house of God at Shiloh. So this guy's probably from that place where the idol is set up. Both these stories are about a wandering Levite on his way to the high country or hill country of Ephraim. In the previous story, that Levite, the previous Levite, ended up ministering at an idolatrous shrine. So Jonathan, the Levite, ended up serving at an idolatrous shrine in the hill country of Ephraim. In this story, a nameless Levite gets his wife back from Judah and is on his way back to Ephraim, where that same idol from the last story ended up residing. I hope that makes sense. All right, Bethlehem and Judah and Ephraim are important places in both of these stories. There's clearly a connection being made here, but what is that connection, right? Well, if you remember, the last two stories were connected by the themes of betrayal and backsliding. Those were the stories of Samson and the tribe of Dan. Remember, there were a lot of hyperlinks between the story of Samson and his prequel about the tribe of Dan taking their false promised land. Both Samson and Micah and the tribe of Dan, and even Jonathan the priest, all backslide. And they all are engaged in some kind of betrayal. So Samson backslides on his oath, right, on his devotion to God, his consecration to God. Jonathan is obviously backsliding as a Levite, and the tribe of Dan is also backsliding. Additionally, Samson was betrayed by Delilah, and Jonathan betrays his host, Micah, for the tribe of Dan, right? So there's themes of betrayal and backsliding that connect and permeate both Samson's story and the story of the tribe of Dan. So that was those two stories. However, here there's also connections between the stories of the founding of the tribe of Dan and this nameless Levite, with this story which is going to be about the civil war in Israel. That connection, I believe, is found in people going to the wrong place and fighting the wrong people. So I should probably explain. In both the story of Micah and of the Danites, there are people who find themselves in the wrong place but think they are going to the right place. So the tribe of Dan convinces themselves to fight the wrong group of people in Laish, and there's also Jonathan, this wandering Levite from the tribe of Judah, who seems to just be in Ephraim for no reason. He doesn't have anything better to do with his life. Now, in this story of Israel's civil war, it's going to be about a civil war. There is also a Levite who is said many times to be sojourning to the hill country of Ephraim. He and his concubine are about to end up in the wrong city at the wrong time. So in the previous story, there was a Levite who's kind of like wandering around, right, and just kind of finds himself in Micah's idol shrine, and the tribe of Dan conquers the wrong city, right? They go to the wrong place. That seems like the right place. And here, it seems like this wandering Levite should go to Gibeah, right? But then his servant says, why don't we go to Jerusalem, Yavuz, right? Like, there's also this theme of a Levite finding himself in the wrong place that seems like the right place. He chooses Gibeah because it's an Israelite town, but his servant seems to imply, hey, we should go to, what would eventually be Jerusalem. You are, as the reader, inclined to think that he should go to Jerusalem, this nameless Levite, but he chooses an Israelite town. So the Levite chooses a place that seems right to him and that by all measures should be the right place to go to. In reality, as we will see, this is a grave mistake and a very bad choice. Just as the tribe of Dan chose the wrong city when they spied out Laish, this Levite chooses the wrong city to spend the night in. The story is also set in parallel with a few other stories in the Bible. For one, there are a lot of connections with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 18 through 19 with this story. I should also point out that both this story that is about to ensue and the story of Sodom and Gomorrah are preceded by a story about the announcement of a miraculous birth. So, Sodom and Gomorrah was preceded by an angel of Yahweh coming to Abraham and announcing to Abraham that he would have a son named Isaac. And the previous story before this is about the tribe of Dan, but also about Samson. It was really all about Samson, whose birth was announced by an angel in a very similar way as Isaac's birth was announced by God in the form of, I believe, 3 angels. Yeah, so in Abraham's story, 3 angels visit him. When he sees them, he shows them radical hospitality. This is also another connection. Those angels are also shown hospitality by Abraham's nephew, Lot. So there are 2 people showing someone hospitality in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Here, this Levite is also shown hospitality by, what would you know it, 2 people, his father-in-law and this wandering stranger from the high country of Ephraim. It's worth noting here that both Lot and this old man from the tribe of Ephraim are not from their respective evil cities when they show a stranger hospitality. So Lot is actually said to be an outsider even by the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah when he houses the 2 angels. And we are told that this old man who houses the Levite and his concubine is from Ephraim and not Gibeah. The authors make that explicit here. This has the effect of showing us, the reader, there's probably not even one single person in both Sodom and Gomorrah, and here Gibeah that are hospitable and by implication righteous. Also, even the hospitality in both of these stories looks really similar. Abraham interestingly tells the angels that he hosts the exact same phrase that the concubine's father tells this Levite. So Abraham and this concubine's father both tell their guests, sustain your heart with a piece of bread. However, in the story in here in Judges, the concubine's father tells the Levite twice to sustain his heart with a piece of bread. There is an exaggerated emphasis in this story of the Levite and his concubine being shown immense hospitality on the part of a Judean. It is almost like the Levite's father-in-law does not want him to leave. Like there's this ominous shadow that looms over the Levite's journey, which the father-in-law may be trying to delay for some reason. Okay, so the stage is set. The Levite and his concubine and his servant are shown hospitality again for the second time by this old man who's not from the city of Gibeah, who's from Ephraim. That is where we are going to pick up our story. Judges 19, starting in verse 22. They were making their hearts merry, and behold, the men of the city, certain sons of Belial, surrounded the house, pounding the door. And they spoke to the owner of the house, the old man, saying, bring out the man who came into your house, that we may know him. Then the man, the owner of the house, went out to them and said to them, no, my brothers, please do not do evil. Since this man has come into my house, do not commit this disgraceful act. Behold, my daughter who is a virgin and his concubine, please let me bring them out, that you may violate them and do to them whatever is good in your eyes. But do not commit such a disgraceful act against this man. But the men were not willing to listen to him. So the man took hold of his concubine and brought her out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night until morning, and they let her go at the breaking of dawn. As the dawn began to break, the woman came and fell down at the doorway of the man's house where her master was, until full daylight. Then her master arose in the morning and opened the doors of the house and went out to go on his way. And behold, the woman, his concubine, was lying at the doorway of the house with her hands on the threshold. And he said to her, get up and let us go. But there was no answer. Then he took her on the donkey, and the man arose and went to his home. Then he entered his house, took a knife, took hold of his concubine, and cut her into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sent her throughout the territory of Israel. And all who saw it said, nothing like this has ever happened or been seen from the day when the sons of Israel came up from the land of Egypt to this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak up. This is probably the darkest part of our story. In it, we see again the theme of the woman and the theme of the seed of the woman in the book of Judges. This theme begins in Genesis, but as we've seen throughout this series, Judges really develops the theme of the seed of the woman, and seems to almost make it its own little theme. It takes it and blows it up in this period and really explores the theme of the seed of the woman and makes it its own little mini theme. Women in the book of Judges are the surprising heroines of the story. They find redemption, they save the day, they lead, but not in the foreground, rather in the background. They are quietly powerful, not commanding or commandeering, not demanding title or prestige or spotlight. Instead, they are content in the shadows, quietly saving the day. And in this way, they diverge from our modern world's obsession of signaling their virtue to everyone by overly exalting and distorting what a powerful and successful woman should look like. They tell them that not only have women been oppressed for most of history, but also that they should just be like men. In Judges and in the Bible, women always save the day in the dark. Women are like Batman. Women are the heroines of the shadows. You could say that they are the dark knights, the gentle, motherly crusaders that don't save Israel by arm wrestling a man, but rather they save Israel by their shrewd, strategic, cunning wisdom and advice. Deborah is in all likelihood a judge, yet she is never listed as a judge. She judges Israel and is a prophetess, but Barak, the valiant military general named after lightning itself, is named as the sheriff of this story by later biblical authors. Yet this valiant hero is unwilling to go to battle without his heroine by his side. When the battle does ensue, it is a woman, as Deborah prophesied, named Yael, who receives the glory and kills Sisera in her tent, by being motherly and not by being masculine. Instead of adopting the characteristics of a man and somehow gaining some magical masculine superhero level strength to physically overpower her enemy, Yael leans into her feminine traits by giving Sisera some warm milk, letting him get settled under a blanket, and then once her deceptive hospitality has done its work, she smashes Sisera's head in with a tent peg while he is sleeping. It is her wisdom and her shrewdness that kills Sisera, not her brute strength. When Gideon's son Abimelech gets out of control and begins burning down towers in the murderous rampage, it is a shrewd, unnamed woman who drops a millstone on him and crushes his head. Samson's parents are portrayed curiously as his father named Manoah and his mother, who is simply an unnamed woman. However, Manoah is portrayed as the bumbling father, and his wife is the one whom the angel appears to both times. It is Samson's mother, this woman alone, who knows the extent of Samson's power. She alone knows the secret to Samson's power is lying within his hair. And then when another woman, this time she is named Delilah or Weakness, learns of Samson's power, she immediately abuses it and saps the power from the strongest man in the Bible. Now this last story of the Judges is centered around a Levite who chases after, of all things, a woman, namely his concubine who has been unfaithful to him. He speaks to her heart, wins her back, but then on their return trip to Ephraim from Judah, he stops in a town in Benjamin, and the men of that city desire to rape him. His host, not someone from that town, offers up his daughter and the Levite's concubine, but in the heat of the moment, the Levite seizes his woman and throws her out to the wolves who rape and murder her. When he gets up the next day, he finds her sprawled out on the ground, with her hand on the threshold of the door, implying that she struggled to get back to the safety of the house unsuccessfully. He tells her quite heartlessly to get up and then realizes that she's dead. He then cuts her up and sends her out to the 12 tribes of Israel to summon their response. The unnamed woman in this story, who up until now and up until this point in Judges has been the unsung heroine who saves the day and desires none of the glory or the honor or the spotlight, is now the victim of her kinsman's own sexual appetite. The woman in this story is murdered by the desires of her countrymen. The woman has gone from the heroine to the martyr. She is put in place of the Levite, and if you remember, a Levite is a priest of God, and we are told this Levite ministers in the house of God. The woman actually is like a substitute that is killed in place of the Levite. Though I wish this story were that noble, because she is given no choice in the matter, and in fact, the old man from Ephraim, whom the Levite stays with, only offers in word his virgin daughter to the ravenous Benjamites, but dares not actually send her to the wolves. This Levite, this minister to Yahweh, actually does throw the heroine in his cowardice to the wolves in his place. The character in this story, who is supposed to be the savior, is brutally raped and murdered by the end of the book. She was supposed to save the day through some subtle act of unseen faith or shrewd wisdom. Instead, this priest, this man who is supposed to be a royal image of God, throws her out to be abused and murdered in his place. This story shows us that when God's people fight amongst themselves, the women, those whom God works to bring about salvation in the shadows, those who should be supporting and helping the men of the story, they are the ones who pay the price. They are the ones who are deprived of safety, dignity, and humanity, and they are the ones who are hurt and killed. Now would also be a good time to talk about Benjamin and why Benjamin is the villain in this story. Why is Benjamin the tribe that is committing this atrocity towards this woman? Birth stories in the Bible are really important. First, because they usually involve the naming of a character, which clues you in to that character's importance or the central struggle of that character's life. But also because they set the theme for that character's offspring and family later on in the Bible. This is very much the case for the tribe of Benjamin. The man that they are named after is the second-born son of Jacob's wife, Rachel. Rachel, early on in her marriage with Jacob, is more loved by Jacob than his other wife, Leah, who also happened to be Rachel's sister. But Rachel is unable to conceive and have children. She so desires to have kids that one day she tells Jacob, "Give me children or I'll die." Jacob responds aptly by telling Rachel, "Am I in the position of God?" In other words, take up your infertility with God, not me. Eventually, Rachel does have a child, and this child will be the savior of Jacob's entire family later on in the book of Genesis. That child's name is Joseph, and it comes from the Hebrew word yasaph, which means to add, because Rachel, after having one child, still isn't satisfied with her desire for children. So she says, "May God add another." Then, later on in Rachel's life, she does indeed have another child. Her desire is met, but in the process of meeting her desire, in the process of her childbirth, she has complications and Rachel begins to die. With her dying breath, she names her second son Ben-Oni, which means son of my sorrow. Rachel's desire for a child was so great that it actually did end up ironically killing her. The woman that said, "Give me children or I'll die," ends up dying, giving birth to a child. It is her son, her desire, which she so desperately wanted, that actually gave her sorrow and literally was the death of her and the end of her life. Jacob, however, after Rachel dies, renames their son from Ben-Oni to Ben-Yamin, or Benjamin, which means son of my right hand. Yet again, we find another character with a split identity and literally a split name. Is Benjamin and his descendants going to be a tribe of sorrow or a tribe of God's right-hand men? In other words, will Rachel's desire be a good thing or a bad thing for this tribe? Will Benjamin's desire be a good thing or a bad thing? Indeed, for most of the rest of the narrative of the Bible, the tribe of Benjamin will be a tribe of desire. They will correspondingly have both great and really terrible people come from that tribe. So let's bring this back to the book of Judges in our story here. That was a lot of context and setup, but here's the payoff. It is these Benjamites' desire that now kills a woman. Literally, they kill her with their own desires, which is like an inversion of Rachel's desires, which ended up killing her. So Rachel had a huge desire for children, and that desire ended up being literally the death of her. Now these Benjamites have sexual desire, And their desire is so great and so intense and so unchecked that they kill a woman and ignite a civil war with their desires. Now the family and descendants of Rachel and Rachel's son Benjamin are so full of unchecked desire that really for no reason at all, they just rape this woman and kill her simply for the fact that they desired her. Their desires have gotten out of check, very much like Rachel. Spoiler alert, the desire of these Benjamites in the city of Gibeah will also result in the near destruction of their entire tribe of Benjamin at the end of this story. So very much like Rachel, their desire ends up killing another woman, but it also ends up almost killing them. The question will remain for the tribe of Benjamin: which name will they adopt? Ben-Oni or Ben-Yamin? The son of my sorrow or my right-hand man? Let's remember that another Benjamite, Ehud, started off saving and unifying Israel at the start of the book. He was a son of Yamin, a son of God's right hand. He was God's right-hand man, right? Even though he was left-handed, very ironically, Ehud was a Benjamite who proverbially and ironically adopted the name son of my right hand. Here, these Benjamites seem to proverbially adopt the name son of my sorrow. I find it really ironic, too, that the Hebrew phrase for being left-handed is right hand impaired, and that the two main stories that involve the tribe of Benjamin, the tribe of the son of my right hand, will involve valiant warriors who are impaired in their right hands. Remember that Hebrew word impaired in the right hand is that's like how you refer to someone who's left-handed, and they're from the tribe of the son of my right hand. Ehud was impaired in his right hand, but saved Israel. He was a son of my right hand. And as we will see, there will be some valiant men who are also impaired in their right hands from the tribe of Benjamin, but they will kill and disunify many of their Israelite brethren and fracture the nation of Israel. Okay, so hope that made sense. Before I spoil more of the story, let's keep going on in the narrative. Judges chapter 20, starting in verse 1. Then all the sons of Israel from Dan to Beersheba, including the land of Gilead, came out, and the congregation assembled as one man to Yahweh at Mizpah. And the cornerstones of all the people, of all the tribes of Israel, took their stand in the assembly of the people of God, 40,000 men who draw the sword. Then the sons of Benjamin heard that the sons of Israel had gone up to Mizpah. And the sons of Israel said, "Tell us, how did this evil take place?" So the Levite, the husband of the woman who was murdered, answered and said, "I came with my concubine to spend the night at Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin." Then the men of Gibeah rose up against me and surrounded the house at night because of me. They intended to kill me. Instead, they violated my concubine, and she died. And I seized my concubine and cut her into pieces and sent her throughout the land of Israel's inheritance, for they have committed a lewd and disgraceful act in Israel. Look, all you sons of Israel, give your advice and counsel here. Then all the people arose as one man and said, "Not one of us will go to his tent, nor will any of us turn aside to his house. But now, this is the thing which we will do to Gibeah. We will go up against it by lot. And we will take 10 men out of 100 throughout the tribes of Israel, and 100 out of 1,000, and 1,000 out of 10,000, in order to take up provisions for the people, that when they come to Gibeah of Benjamin, they may do to them according to all the disgraceful acts that they have done to Israel." Thus all the men of Israel gathered against the city, united as one man. Then the tribes of Israel sent men to the entire tribe of Benjamin, saying, "What is this evil thing that has taken place among you? So now give up the men, the sons of Belial and Gibeah, that we may put them to death and purge this evil from Israel." But the sons of Benjamin were not willing to listen to the voice of their brothers, the sons of Israel. Then the sons of Benjamin gathered from their cities to Gibeah to go out to battle against the sons of Israel. And from the cities on that day that the sons of Benjamin were numbered, 26,000 men who draw the sword, besides the inhabitants of Gibeah, who were numbered 700 choice men. Out of all these people, 700 choice men were left-handed or right-hand impaired. Each one could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. And the men of Israel, besides Benjamin, were numbered 400,000 men who draw the sword. All these were men of war. Then the sons of Israel arose, went up to Bethel, and asked God, and said, "Who shall go up for us to begin the battle against the sons of Benjamin?" Then Yahweh said, "Judah shall begin it." Okay, so all of Israel, except for Benjamin, assembles together, and this Levite tells them what happened. Interestingly, in his recounting, he says that the men of Gibeah only wanted to kill him, not to rape him and to sleep with him. He then says that they raped his concubine and murdered her. They respond by saying no one will go to their home or their tent. This phrase that no one will go to their home or their tent is really similar to a phrase used in Joshua when Joshua is getting Israel ready to prepare to take the promised land. So he's like marshaling the troops and they're about to take the promised land. He and his people will often say that no one will go to their tent or their home till they have conquered all of the promised land and like destroyed all the inhabitants of the land. So this phrase, I think, portrays Israel here in this story as conquering the inhabitants of Canaan all over again. But instead of conquering a foreign nation for their land, they are fighting their own brothers. So it's like the tribe of Benjamin has turned into those sinful Canaanites that Israel had to expunge and expel in the story in the book of Joshua. It's almost like this story is framed as a self-conquest of sorts. In other words, Israel seems to be painted here as conquesting the inhabitants of Canaan like they did in the book of Joshua, but instead of killing the foreign inhabitants, they are killing their own brethren, presumably because the tribe of Benjamin has become more sinful than the inhabitants of the land of Canaan. So Israel musters up 40,000 men, and they get a tenth of these men to gather provisions for the war. Then they ask Benjamin to give up the men who did this. Like they want to try to make peace before they actually have to go to war, right? Just put to death the men that did this. But Benjamin refuses. They gather 26,000 men and 700 elite sharp slingers. 700 men who are right-handed impaired or left-handed that can sling a stone at a hair and not miss. They can cut a hair with a sling with a stone. So they're really accurate, right? Very, very valiant men. Again, this mirrors the left-handed assassin Ehud, who was from the tribe of Benjamin at the beginning of this book. Now the two sides are set, so Israel approaches Yahweh before the battle. And much like the very beginning of the book of Judges, the very beginning of this book, they asked Yahweh, who will go up for us first? Just like the beginning of the book of Judges, Yahweh responds with Judah. So there's a parallel there, a little Bible sandwich, right? This whole book is sandwiched by Israel asking who will go up first to invade and to conquer the promised land, and both times Judah is chosen. I should mention here that in the beginning of the book of Judges, it's not just Judah that goes up first. Judah goes up into battle with his brother Simeon. Simeon was Judah's full brother, right? They weren't half brothers like most of the rest of the tribes of Israel. They were full brothers. So whereas the beginning of this book had Yahweh sending out two full brothers, Judah and Simeon, who were fighting side by side against the local inhabitants, now the book has ended with Yahweh sending out Judah first, alone, without a brother, to fight against his own brother. This book started out with brother fighting alongside brother. Now it is ending with brother fighting against brother. Okay, hope that made sense. Judah goes up first, the civil war commences, and this is where we're going to pick up our story. Judges chapter 20, verse 19. So the sons of Israel arose in the morning and camped against Gibeah. And the men of Israel went out to battle against Benjamin. And the men of Israel arranged themselves for battle against them at Gibeah. Then the sons of Benjamin came out of Gibeah and destroyed to the ground on that day 22,000 men of Israel. But the men of Israel, strengthened themselves, arranged themselves for battle again, and in the place where they had arranged themselves the first day. And the sons of Israel went up and wept before Yahweh until evening, and asked of Yahweh, saying, "Shall we again approach for battle against the sons of my brother Benjamin?" And Yahweh said, "Go up against him." Then the sons of Israel drew near to the sons of Benjamin the second day, and Benjamin went out to meet them from Gibeah the second day, and destroyed to the ground 18,000 men of the sons of Israel. Then all the sons of Israel and all the people went up and came to Bethel and wept. Thus they remained before Yahweh and fasted that day until evening, and they offered up burnt offerings and peace offerings to Yahweh. Then the sons of Israel asked of Yahweh. Now the ark of the covenant of God was there in those days, and Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, Aaron's son, stood before it. to minister to it in those days. And he said, shall I yet again go out to battle against the sons of my brother Benjamin, or shall I cease? And Yahweh said, go up, for tomorrow I will give them into your hand. Okay, so Judah first goes up to battle. They all line up. They, think they have God's approval and blessing, and 22,000 men die in the battle. So they go before Yahweh again, and then they die again, right? And you can hear in their voice in this when they ask of God, before they go into the second battle, like how hesitant they are to fight in this war. And not only are they losing a lot of men, but they say, shall we advance for battle against the sons of my brother Benjamin, right? They call Benjamin their brother, not their enemy, and they're losing a lot of men. Yahweh says yes again. They go on for round 2. They're destroyed again and lose another 18,000 men, totaling 40,000 men in losses. So they're losing a lot of men, right? And even though they outnumber the tribe of Benjamin. Israel goes for a third time to marshal to battle against Benjamin, but before this, they fast and weep before Yahweh. This time, they bring burnt offerings and peace offerings, and this time we're giving a really interesting detail, something that's very, very important, and it's like super important to our story. Okay, so the sons of Israel asked of Yahweh, and now the authors just kind of like jump on a side tangent. They say, now the ark of God, of the covenant of God, was there in those days, and Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, Aaron's son, stood before it to minister it in those days. Two things are really, really important here. There's one really important takeaway from this small detail. So the first thing that's really important here is Phinehas, the son of Eleazar. Who is Phinehas? Well, Phinehas is the grandson of Aaron. If you didn't know, this guy was born in the wilderness wanderings. Again, just like the Levite from our previous story, Jonathan, the son of the grandson of Moses, Phinehas is born well into the Israelites' years of wandering the wilderness in Exodus. So these guys are, like Jonathan was the grandson of Moses, and here Phinehas is the grandson of Aaron. They're both born, and Phinehas actually does show up in the wilderness wandering stories. Unlike Jonathan, Phinehas shows up in a couple of places, and he's actually shown as really righteous when he does show up. So here's a few times when he shows up. The most notable time for our story is in the end of the book of Joshua. Phinehas shows up, and he does the exact opposite thing of what he does here. In the end of the book of Joshua, Phinehas actually averts a civil war in Israel. In that story, he goes to the 2.5 tribes of Israel that lived across the Jordan. So there was most of Israel lived west of the Jordan, but there were 2.5 tribes in Israel that chose to live east of the Jordan. And it's like a prominent theme in the book of Joshua, right? And Phinehas goes to these guys as the priest representing all of Israel, and he's ready to go to war with their brothers for setting up an alternate place of worship and worshiping Yahweh in a sinful way. So they heard, hey, the 2.5 tribes east of the Jordan, they set up their own altar to God. They set up their own idolatrous shrine, kind of like the golden calf, right? So Phinehas comes as like a representative for all Israel. Here in the story in Joshua, Phinehas, just before the civil war ensues, right? Like Israel has all the troops lined up. Phinehas comes. They're about to go to war, and he asks the 2.5 tribes across the Jordan, like what they're doing, and they tell Phinehas that the altar is just like a replica. It's just a reminder. They don't actually intend to use it as a place of worship. It's not meant to be idolatrous. They tell him, hey, this is a whole misunderstanding. It's just a monument to remind us of the true place of worship inside the promised land. To always worship Yahweh alone. We would never worship at this fake altar, right? And Phinehas is happy, and the civil war is averted. So the end of the book of Joshua ends with Phinehas averting a civil war. The end of the book of Judges ends with Phinehas like endorsing a civil war very hesitantly, right? So two different paintings of a civil war. Here, Phinehas is this guy's clearly the same guy from the book of Joshua, and he's also from the Torah. And In the book of Joshua, he's the one interceding before Yahweh and asking if Yahweh should continue to go to war against their own brother. Here he's asking if Israel should continue to go to war against their own brother. He's also ministering before the ark of God. He is essentially the high priest, and on the third time of inquiring before God, he is the one asking God if Israel should continue to go to war with their brother. Phinehas is like this peacemaker, right? And Joshua, he was able to make peace. Here, he's advocating for peace, but then God says, no, keep fighting, keep going to war. You need to see this thing through. Is this civil war really God's will? Does God really want Israel to fight their own brother? Again, Phinehas is an intercessor before God, and he's a righteous intercessor. Yet again, trying to stop a civil war, but this time, instead of there being a misunderstanding of some false worship, there is no misunderstanding at all. The tribe of Benjamin is in the wrong, and they're refusing to repent, and God tells them to keep fighting. So that's the first important thing, but it begs another important question. Really, it drops a bomb that's really easy to miss. I've mentioned this before. This kind of brings me to our Bible conspiracy theory of the week. That theory concerns the period of time in which this story takes place, and as you may have guessed, the last story in the book of Judges, does it take place at the end of 12 generations of chronological judges that rise up and fall, like after the conquest of the Promised Land and before the kingship? Or is it actually a flashback? Is this another flashback, just like the previous story about the tribe of Dan was also a flashback towards the time of Joshua and the conquest of the Promised Land? Phinehas would have had to live for centuries to set the story at the end of the period of Judges. I think that this little note and this little detail is clearly telling you, the reader, this is another flashback, and it is set in the same time period as the previous story of the tribe of Dan, during the end or during the middle of the conquest of the land of Canaan. This would set our story in the same time period as the end or the middle of the book of Joshua. This means, as I've said many times before in this podcast, the book of Judges is not telling Israel's downward moral spiral temporally through time, but rather Judges is telling a story of the thematic downward spiral of Israel morally. It can jump back and forth through time in order to paint that thematic downward spiral. It's also worth noting here that only 2 stories in the book of Judges has this tagline: in those days there was no king in Israel. And that is in these last 2 stories, first about the tribe of Dan and the next about the civil war between Israel and the tribe of Benjamin. I think the authors use this phrase multiple times at the end of this book because they want you to know exactly when these stories take place. It seems very likely to me that the beginning of the end of Judges is set directly during the conquest of the Promised Land, and that the middle stories that actually contain the 12 judges is a bit more blurry in when in time they take place, and it probably doesn't matter as much when the story of the 12 judges actually takes place. In other words, in the central stories of the book of Judges about the 12 actual judges, it seems that they don't care when the authors don't care when the stories of the actual judges takes place, but in the stories at that bookend Judges, they seem to want you to know very specifically when these stories take place, and that these stories take place closer to or even during the conquest of the land under Joshua. So what's my point? What's the point of this story taking place during the same time period of Joshua? Why is that so important? Here's my Bible conspiracy theory of the week. I believe that Judges is offering an alternative history of the conquest of the Promised Land. This book, Judges, portrays Phinehas as having to endorse a civil war between Israel and Benjamin, whereas in the book of Joshua, Phinehas is portrayed as averting a civil war between Israel and the 2.5 tribes east of the Jordan. The tribe of Dan is also portrayed as deceiving themselves into taking the wrong city of Laish in Judges, but in Joshua, they are portrayed as being expelled from the cities of Zorah and Eshtaol and just finding a different city. So in Judges, Dan is portrayed as running away from the true Promised Land and spying out their false promised Neverland, whereas in Joshua, they are portrayed as simply taking a different city within that promised land. Additionally, in Joshua, Israel is painted as a nation that is faithful to Yahweh and able to avert a civil war, which was caused just by it's a simple misunderstanding of how some of the tribes chose to stay faithful to Yahweh. But in Judges, Israel is portrayed as so fractured and so sinful, even during the lifetime of Phinehas, that they must go through a bloody civil war to expel this terrible, egregious sin that's worse than the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah from their own tribe, from the tribe of Benjamin. In other words, the book of Joshua paints Israel as mostly righteous, conquesting a sinful inhabitants and people group of the land of Canaan, whereas Judges paints Israel as a nation that is immediately more sinful than even the inhabitants of Canaan that they conquested. Even during their own conquest of the Promised Land, part of Israel is worse than the inhabitants of the land of Canaan. Let's keep going. It would be a good time to talk about now about Phinehas' name. I think it's a very fitting name and has a really interesting ambiguity that mirrors the two opposing stories that he's involved with the two civil wars. Phinehas' name is eerily close to the two Hebrew words peh and nachash. Peh means mouth. Nachash is a Hebrew word for snake. But nachash has essentially the same letters in Hebrew as the word for bronze, or nachoshet. So the name Phinehas or Pinachas could be taken to mean bronze mouth, or could also be taken to mean serpent's mouth. This could be a name that denotes either his evil snake-like qualities, or it could be referencing his Moses-like qualities. I say this because Moses was able to turn his staff into a serpent and a sea monster. Moses also saved the Israelites by placing a bronze snake on a pole for all of Israel to look to in order to be healed. So snake and bronze, Moses was closely associated with. Moses was pictured as being able to conquer the serpent. He could control the serpent. He was also a mouthpiece for God. Phinehas, interestingly, is also consistently shown as a righteous intercessor for God. He's a good priest. Throughout most of the stories in the Bible, Phinehas is painted as a righteous intercessor. So I'm inclined to see this name as a master of bronze, or a master of the snake, so to speak. I say this because bronze is a metal of intercession in the Bible. So it's pretty fitting that, his name would be like bronze mouth or snake mouth, right? Phinehas' name can also carry with it two stories, right? He could be the snake mouth or the bronze mouth, right? Which story is it going to be? Ironically, I do think Phinehas is painted mostly as a conqueror, as a commander of the snake, this righteous intercessor, right? Okay, so a little bit of a nerdy tangent. Back to our story. And my theory that Judges offers a parallel and opposing narrative to the one put forth in the book of Joshua. I think that my theory explains a lot. In Joshua, the focus is on the inheritance of God's people, God's promises for the people of God, whereas in Judges, the focus is on the very quick downward spiral of sin within the promised land. Judges focuses on the sins of the people and the grace of God, whereas Joshua focuses on the promises of God. I believe that Judges paints a very pessimistic view of the Israelites' faithfulness towards God, whereas Joshua seems to paint this same generation of Israelites who take the promised land as this golden era of Israel's faithfulness. Of course, there are a few unfaithful Israelites who are expelled in the book of Joshua, but for the most part, Israel is completely faithful under Joshua and the elders who lived during Joshua's lifetime and tenure. But from the perspective of the author of the Judges, Israel has, even in the height of their conquest, deep, deep sin going on within their tribes. There are a lot of hidden exiles and falls from grace that happened during the conquest of the Promised Land, which the authors of the Judges only now make you privy to. That was a lot. Okay. Whew. Bible conspiracy theory over. Let's get back to the story. Phinehas has just asked God if Israel should attack their brother Benjamin for a third time. God told Phinehas to go again because he has given them into Israel's hand this time. So It's the third time going into battle. Let's pick it up back in the story in Judges, starting in chapter 20, verse 29. So Israel sent men in ambush around Gibeah, and the sons of Israel went up against the sons of Benjamin on the third day and arrayed themselves against Gibeah as at other times. So the sons of Benjamin went out to meet the people and were drawn away from the city, and they began to strike and slay some of the people, as at other times on the highways, one of which goes up to Bethel and the other to Gibeah, and in the field about 30 men of Israel. And the sons of Benjamin said, They are defeated before us as at the first. But the sons of Israel said, Let us flee, that we may draw them away from the city to the highways. Then all the men of Israel arose from the place and arrayed themselves at Baal Tamar, or the Lord of the palm tree. And the men of Israel in ambush burst forth from their place, even out of Ma'are Gava, or the open hill. Then 10,000 choice men from all Israel came against Gibeah, and the battle became heavy. But Benjamin did not know that calamity was about to touch them. Then Yahweh defeated Benjamin before Israel, so that the sons of Israel destroyed 25,100 men of Benjamin that day, all who drew the sword. So the sons of Benjamin saw that they were defeated. Now the men of Israel had given ground to Benjamin, because they relied on the men in ambush whom they had set against Gibeah. So the men in ambush hurried and rushed against Gibeah. Then the men in ambush deployed and struck all the city with the edge of the sword. Now the appointed sign between the men of Israel and the men in ambush was that they would make a great cloud of smoke rise from the city. So the men of Israel turned around in the battle, and Benjamin had begun to strike and slay about 30 men of Israel. For they said, Surely they are defeated before us as in the first battle. But the cloud began to rise from the city in a column of smoke. And Benjamin turned behind him, and look, the whole city was going up in smoke to the heavens. Then the men of Israel turned again, and the men of Benjamin were dismayed, for they saw that calamity had touched them. Therefore they turned their backs from the men of Israel toward the direction of the wilderness. But the battle overtook them, and those who came out of the cities destroyed them in the midst of them. They surrounded Benjamin, pursued them without rest, trod them down against opposite Gibeah to the east toward the sunrise. Thus 18,000 men of Benjamin fell, and the rest turned and fled toward the wilderness of the pomegranate rock. And they gleaned 5,000 of them on the highways and overtook them on Kidom and struck down 2,000 of them. So all of Benjamin fell on that day with 25,000 men. But 600 men turned and fled toward the wilderness to the pomegranate rock, and they remained at the pomegranate rock 4 months. Now the men of Israel returned to the sons of Benjamin and struck them with the edge of the sword, both the entire city with the cattle and all they found, and they also set fire on all the cities which they found. Oh, long passage. So there's a few things to note here. First of all, it is on the third day that this third battle takes place, and Israel loses 30 men during their initial retreat, which was designed to lure Benjamin out of their city. 3 is a prominent number again. It is like Israel is passing the test on this third battle, right? But what was the test? Well, I think the test was their persistence to continue to fight in this war which they did not want to fight in. It was Phinehas inquiring to God about if this is the right move to do. It was perseverance. It was continuing to stand up against this heinous crime. I think one of the takeaways we're supposed to have in this story is that sometimes it takes persistence to discern the will of God. This is a really nice contrast between the last story about the tribe of Dan. In both stories, people find themselves in the wrong place, in a wrong place that feels like the right place. In both stories, there are Israelites who are conquesting the promised land. But in the previous story, ironically, it looked like the tribe of Dan was taking the right land, but instead they are convincing themselves out of God's actual promises and digging themselves deeper into the wrong conquest. Here, the 11 tribes of Israel feel like they are in a war they should not be engaged in. They feel like they're in the wrong conquest. Even Phinehas' prayer to God is carried with hesitation. He says, Shall we again approach for battle against the sons of my brother Benjamin? Brothers should not be fighting and killing other brothers. But somehow, this war, which seems to be the wrong conquest, is actually the right conquest and is approved by God. I think we're supposed to see how difficult it can be to discern the will of God and how it's not always formulaic and black and white, or black and white. Many times, the wrong decision looks like the right one to make, but the right decision looks like the wrong one to make. In both stories, a Levite approves of a conquest. In the previous story, the tribe of Dan, the grandson of Moses, Jonathan, approves of the tribe of Dan's conquest. But he also presides over a cursed and idolatrous shrine and cheats his boss, Micah. In this story, Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, is the one who hesitantly asks God if this is really the right conquest. Phinehas is consistently shown as a righteous priest before God in pretty much all the stories that he appears in. And here, he is unsure if this is the right conquest. So, Israel is successful in this self-conquest of their fellow tribe of Benjamin. In fact, it is so successful that Israel doesn't really know when to stop. After taking the city of Gibeah, Israel is set to set on fire every city which they find. So this destruction is so complete that when they finish, there's only a small remnant left of the tribe of Benjamin. These 600 men who are hiding out at this place called the Pomegranate Rock. As a side note here, most translations render this as the Rock of Rimmon, but Rimmon is the Hebrew word for pomegranate, so I think Pomegranate Rock is a better translation. It's my humble amateur opinion. So we are left at the end of this conquest with a small remnant of God's people living near a rock in the wilderness. This feels very similar to me like the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings. In that story, God has a remnant of humanity, the nation of Israel, that has escaped his wrath and has been sent into the wilderness. In the Exodus narrative, interestingly, Israel finds itself twice almost dying of thirst because they have no water while they're in the wilderness, and twice God provides a rock when they're dying of thirst in the wilderness. God provides water from a rock in the wilderness when they're dying of thirst. So here there's a small remnant of the tribe of Benjamin that is living next to a rock in the wilderness as well, and like the Exodus narrative, there's going to be a tension that will need to be resolved. How will this remnant that has escaped God's wrath live on? Let's keep reading to find that out. This is a much shorter passage. Judges 21, starting in verse 1. Now the men of Israel had sworn in Mitzpah, saying, "None of us shall give his daughter to Benjamin as a wife." So the people came to Bethel and sat there before God until evening and lifted up their voices and wept bitterly. And they said, "Why, O Yahweh, God of Israel, has this come about in Israel, so that one tribe should be missing today from Israel?" Now it happened the next day that the people arose early and built an altar there and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. Then the sons of Israel said, "Who is there among all the tribes of Israel who did not come up to the assembly to Yahweh?" For they had taken a great oath concerning him who did not come up to Yahweh at Mitzpah, saying, "He shall surely be put to death." And the sons of Israel were sorry for their brother Benjamin and said, "One tribe is cut off from Israel today. What shall we do for wives for those who are left? But we have sworn by Yahweh not to give them any of our daughters in marriage." Okay, this is where the tension has arisen. It has arisen from this oath that the Israelites took while they were at, of all places, Mitzpah. Remember, Mitzpah is this place where you can make an oath before God, and it's like, Mitzpah means watchtower. It's like God is like watching over the oaths that you make with other people. There was another judge who also made a very hasty, unwise oath, also at Mitzpah, and that was Yiftach. Yiftach made a vow, an oath that ended up cursing his daughter to die and cutting off his whole family from the line of Israel. And here, 11 tribes in their zeal and passion make an oath that none of them would ever give up their daughter to a Benjamite, probably after they see what the men from Benjamin are capable of doing to another woman. But in their oath and in their zeal, they find themselves in a predicament at the end of war. So they almost, like Yiftach, cut off their entire line, right? They almost cut off an entire family from Israel. Like Benjamin might not have any offsprings, and Benjamin might not have any offspring because of this oath that the 11 tribes of Israel made at Mitzpah, and Yiftach also made an oath at Mitzpah, and he actually did cut off any descendants from his family. So the 11 tribes of Israel actually seem to have acted like an instrument of God's divine wrath here, but almost like too well. Similar to Yiftach, the family line of Benjamin looks like it's about to be completely cut off. So now the Israelites are going to have to do something to get some wives for their brothers who have survived God's wrath. But the question is, how are they going to go about getting those wives? Are they going to go about this process in a wise or foolish way? In other words, how are they going to help their tribe who is on the brink of extinction attain life again? How are they going to find salvation? I think this is still paralleled with those 2 times that Israel found themselves in the wilderness about to die of thirst next to a rock. They were close to extinction in the wilderness next to a rock. I say that because in those stories, Israel was tested with a moment of scarcity. The test was about how they were going to respond to the threat of death and extinction in the wilderness. Will you respond with faithfulness towards God or with doubt? Here, Israel is going to come up with 2 ideas to keep this remnant from extinction. The question we as the readers are left to ponder is, are these 2 choices they make made out of faith and trust in God, or are they made out of doubt or their own scheming and their own plans? So let's see. Let's see for ourselves. Let's keep reading. Judges chapter 21, starting in verse 8. So they said, what one is there of the tribes of Israel who did not come up to Yahweh at Mitzpah? And behold, no one had come to the camp from Yavesh Gilead to the assembly. Indeed, the people were numbered, but behold, not one of the inhabitants of Yavesh Gilead was there. And the congregation sent 12,000 men of valor there, and commanded them, saying, strike down the inhabitants of Yavesh Gilead with the edge of the sword, with the woman and the little ones. Now this is the thing that you shall do. You shall devote to destruction every man and woman who has known, that is, who has laid with another man. And they found among the inhabitants of Yavesh Gilead 400 young virgins who had not known a man by lying with them. And they brought them to the camp at Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan. Then the whole congregation sent word and spoke to the sons of Benjamin who were at the pomegranate rock, and called to them, and called out shalom to them, or peace to them. Then Benjamin returned at that time, and they gave them the woman that they had kept alive from the woman of Yavesh Gilead. Yet they did not find enough for them. And the people were sorry for Benjamin, because Yahweh made a breach in the tribes of Israel. Then the elders of the congregation said, what shall we do for the wives for those who are left? Since the women are destroyed out of Benjamin. And they said, there must be a possession for the survivors of Benjamin, so that a tribe will not be blotted out from Israel. But we cannot give them wives of our daughters, for the sons of Israel had sworn, cursed is he who gives a wife to Benjamin. So they said, look, there is a feast of Yahweh from year to year in Shiloh, which is on the north side of Bethel, on the east of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem, and on the south side of Lebonah. And they commanded the sons of Benjamin, saying, go and lie in wait in the vineyards, and watch, and look. If the daughters of Shiloh come out to dance, then you shall come out of the vineyards, and each of you shall catch his wife from the daughters of Shiloh, and go to the land of Benjamin. And it will be, when their fathers or their brothers come to contend with us, we will say to them, be gracious to us concerning them, because we did not take for each man of Benjamin a wife in the battle, because you did not give your daughters to them, otherwise you would now be guilty. Now the sons of Benjamin did so, carried away wives according to their number from those who danced, whom they stole away. And they went and returned to their inheritance, and rebuilt the cities, and lived in them. Then the sons of Israel went away from there at that time, every man to his tribe and his family, and each one of them went out from there to his inheritance. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Okay, a roundabout way of saying that these are the 2 ideas. Burn out a city, kill everyone in it, and just take all the virgin women, or just straight up steal some woman from this local festival, and if any of the men ask you why you're, stealing their daughters, tell them, have grace, my brother. we couldn't give them our own daughters because we cursed anyone who gave them their daughters. So since you didn't give them your daughters in marriage, you're technically not under the curse we placed. So what do you think? Are either of these two decisions made out of moral integrity and trust in God? Well, at the outset, it seems like they're both pretty foolish. However, I would like to argue that the first decision was actually a decision made out of faith. To do this, I would like to point out that the Israelites actually made 2 oaths before God at Mitzvah. We already talked about the first oath, that they wouldn't give any of their daughters in marriage to a Benjamite. There was a second oath in verse 5 that I didn't mention yet. In verse 5, we are told that the sons of Israel said, "Who is there among the tribes of Israel who did not come up in the assembly to Yahweh? For they had taken a great oath concerning him who did not come up to Yahweh at Mitzvah, saying, he shall surely be put to death." Okay, so we see that in destroying Yavesh Gil'ad and taking the young woman to be given to be married to the Benjamites, Israel is actually fulfilling one of their oaths. They said, if anyone didn't come up with us to endorse this civil war and to oppose Benjamin and their sin, we're going to put them to death, and we're going to take an oath before God here. And they actually honor that oath, and that's the first idea to get Benjamin some woman, right? They're like, hey, we're going to honor this oath. We said anyone who didn't come up with us to help engage in the civil war, we're going to burn them down and destroy the city. It's a pretty intense oath, but they honor it. However, in their second oath, when they steal the woman from Shiloh, they're trying to get around their oath of cursing anyone who would give their daughter in marriage to a Benjamite. We are even given this weird, long, roundabout explanation that the Benjamites are supposed to tell the fathers of the woman they steal when they ask for their daughters back, right? Essentially, the logic of the oath goes like this. Technically, since we said that anyone who gave his daughter to a Benjamite would be cursed, but since you didn't give your daughter to a Benjamite because, we stole her from you, then you won't be placed under a curse. This would be a good time to mention that the very next book in the Hebrew Bible, the Samuel scroll, opens up with a series of stories where the town of Shiloh is actually cursed. And it's cursed by God multiple times. Then later on in the book of Samuel, Shiloh is burned down and completely destroyed by a king, guess where? From the tribe of Benjamin. Remember, Shiloh already has that cursed idol residing in it. It's pretty foreboding, right? It's called this resting place, but it's like this anti-resting place that's almost cursed from the outset of its mentionings in the Bible. It should also be noted here that in the book of Samuel, somehow the city of Yavesh Gilead survived this utter destruction that Israel imparts upon it, right? They actually come back up in the book of Samuel, Yavesh Gilead, and somehow there are people living in this city that was supposed to be burned to the ground and completely destroyed. When we meet the people of Yavesh Gilead again, they are on the brink of destruction yet again. And Saul, that same king from the tribe of Benjamin, who will later burn down Shiloh, ends up saving Yavesh Gilead. So, I actually think that the fates of these two cities and these two decisions speak for themselves. Let me explain. I think that Yavesh Gilead was a way of doing some pretty intense and difficult things to honor an oath. Again, Israel is doing the difficult but the right thing again. They kill and burn down an entire city full of their own brothers and sisters, but even though Yavesh Gilead was said to be destroyed, it seems to have survived. And what's more, when Israel does destroy the city, they are honoring their word and their vow before God, even when it's difficult. So Yavesh Gilead ends up being saved from the brink of death later on in the next book. But Shiloh is like the opposite of Yavesh. Shiloh is Israel's way of literally, quote unquote, taking women for themselves. It is also them trying to talk themselves out of their own words. They're trying to get out of their own oath and scheme and maneuver their way out of their oath instead of doing the difficult thing and honoring their oath even when it's difficult. Israel is not really being true and faithful to the oath that they made, right? And ironically, they end up cursing the daughters of Shiloh. Even though they seem to tell the people of Shiloh that they won't be cursed, that they aren't technically giving them their daughters in marriage to a Benjamite, the city and the priesthood that resides in Shiloh will immediately be cursed in the next few stories of the Bible and will ultimately be destroyed. Then, after this story about Shiloh, we're reminded, again by the authors, that in those days, remember guys, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And that's it. That's how the book of Judges ends. I actually think that is a very fitting ending. It is a bleak picture of what happens in the wild west of the Bible. People come up with ridiculous plans. They are extremely foolish. It is lawless, chaotic, and dangerous, but there is a shred of hope within these two decisions. There is yet again a mixed bag of decisions and people and a split identity for the people of Benjamin. One that is faithful to their oath and words, and the other which is deceptive, cunning, and unfaithful to their oath. It is ironic that the tribe of Benjamin will bring forth their line, like will preserve the line of the tribe of Benjamin through these two, like literally woman from a decision from the city of Yavesh Gilead, and this decision that was made out of faithfulness to their oath, and woman from the city of Shiloh, which was made out of their foolishness and their deceptiveness and trying to get out of their own oaths and words. And you'll see literally that Benjamin, because of that, has kind of a split identity in the next book, in the book of Samuel. Okay, there's one more thing to note here. This last scene of the dancing girls being abducted by the men of Benjamin from this weird scheme concocted by Israel may still seem strange and kind of like an ominous and dour note to end the book on, right? I get that, Wesley. Like, it's, these two decisions, right? And it's like the split identity, right? Again, for the tribe of Benjamin. It's kind of still a weird way to end the book so abruptly. But I still think that this is actually a really fitting ending to the book of Judges. And I say that because this ending completes the theme of woman in the book of Judges. Remember, all the way back in our first episode, Judges began with a story that was copy and pasted from the book of Joshua. There's this weird story about woman again, where Caleb's daughter Achsah was given over to Caleb's brother Othniel. This last story begins with a Levite looking for his wife and pursuing her to win her heart over again. And then this story in the book of Judges ends with, yet again, the search for wives. So Judges begins with Othniel searching for a wife, and this story begins, and the whole book of Judges ends with people searching for wives. Whereas this book began with Othniel storming a holy city, Kirjath Sefer, the city of the scroll, saving the day, and getting a wife through his faith, honor, and bravery. Now the book of Judges ends with the tribe of Benjamin partly honoring God and partly dishonoring God and their words in their search for enough women to bring about salvation for the tribe. So in other words, Othniel, the book of Judges starts with Othniel getting a wife in an honorable way, and it ends with Benjamin, the whole tribe of Benjamin, looking for wives and partly doing it in an honorable way and partly doing it in a pretty dishonorable way. This gives new meaning to the last phrase of the book of Judges, that Israel did whatever was good in their own eyes because they had no king. What will be the result of Israel's scheming in order to rebuild a fractured people and a fractured tribe? But also, what will be the result of Israel trusting in God to find a wife and bring about salvation for this fractured tribe? We'll see all of those themes of a woman, a king, and how you bring about salvation. All of that, all of these themes and all of these questions about what is the outcome and the end of these decisions, that will all be interwoven in the storyline of the Samuel scroll. That was a lot. Hope that made sense. That is the book of Judges. Judges is one of my favorite books in the Bible because it is raw and real. It is both faith-building and sobering. It feels to me so realistic because so many of us, like these characters, are in one moment shining reflections of the glory of God, and in the next moment we're reflections of the devil himself. We are dirt and divine breath. The heroes of this story and the heroes of this book, in my opinion, are healthy representations of what real heroes look like. They look like flawed and faithful men and women of God. The Wild West of the Bible doesn't sugarcoat its stories or its messages, but it also isn't devoid of hope. It is able to gaze into the black diamonds, the dirty, the messy beginnings of the nation of Israel, and to be both pessimistic and optimistic, to be both realistic and faithful at the same time. And that is the book of Sheriffs. Thanks for listening, guys. I'll see y'all next time.